Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. It's Tuesday, April 23rd. Our topic for tonight is what World War III looks like and the Aqsa plot. So, I think I'm going to start off by sharing an article from The Intercept on what World War III looks like. That might be quite interesting. Actually, I think it is interesting, but I think perhaps it's quite wrong. Lana, hi. She says, listening in the background, I share to Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, Lana. Hi, Steve Wolfbrand. How are you doing tonight? Looks like Summer Lee won her primary in Pennsylvania. In spite of the efforts of AIPAC to get her, that's very good news. Of course, I'm sure AIPAC will probably be back in the general election, this time supporting a Republican against her. That's probably going to go on, I'm sure. Anyway, about to share the screen for an article from The Intercept. There it is. The title of it is Israel Attack on Iran is what World War III looks like. Like countless other hostilities, the stealthy Israeli missile and drone strike on Iran doesn't risk war, it is war. Now, I guess the first thing I have to comment on is that subtitle. The article was written by Ken Klippenstein and Daniel Boguslaw for The Intercept, published on April 20th, 2024, so it is a few days old. And the first comment has to be, well, we are not yet seeing a nuclear war. So if World War III looks like this, then at least it doesn't look like a nuclear war. They may want to say it is war, but then they also have to talk about who's involved, in this war. In World War II, all sorts of nations were involved in various ways. This war is so far confined to relatively few nations, perhaps. But anyway, let's go through the article and see. There's a graphic, planet Earth vanishes as ongoing conflicts constitute the real World War III that is all around. Israel's attack on Iran late Thursday night was met with a dangerously premature sigh of relief from both the news media and U.S. government that somehow full-scale war was avoided. Outlets like the New York Times were quick to characterize the attack as subdued and limited in scope, pointing to Iranian statements that the attack was launched from within Iranian borders and used small drones rather than fighter jets. Then it was further revealed that the Israeli attack included a stealth cruise missile launched from long range so as not to upset Israel's new Arab partners. And Klippenstein and Bogus Law then say, I think they provide one of their key statements, which is, but this in fact is what actual war looks like these days. Sometimes it's a volley of 300 missiles and drones. Sometimes it is lean, targeted, and carried out covertly. Gone are the days of vast conquering armies and conventional military confrontations between two parties. So long as experts, the government, and the media worry only about a kind of war that is obsolete, it cannot see the war in front of our faces. The misconception has even infected the U.S. government. Quote, the downplaying of direct attacks on its soil may indicate the Islamic Republic lacks the desire or capability to match its bluster with professed military might, unquote. The State Department communique produced after the attack and obtained by the Intercept says, quote, over weeks of unprecedented military exchanges between Iran and Israel, Iranian officials appear keen to avoid further escalation, unquote. Well, perhaps they want to avoid further escalation because they're trying to avoid, a nuclear war or a more generalized kind of regional war than what they have now. I know the Iranians are quite well aware that the axis of resistance is in a war with the United States, its allies, and Israel. Of course, that's obvious. And of course, they know that that's a war. But from their point of view, it's not a full-blown war yet. Because you don't see Hezbollah launching a large-scale attack on Israel with its full missile and rocket might and more than 100,000 soldiers marching into northern Israel. You do not see that, okay? Arguably, that's what Hezbollah and the axis of resistance is trying to avoid. They consider that a full-blown regional war, and they consider this a continuing set of circumstances, which is not quite the same as war. On Thursday, prior to the attack, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian vowed that if Israel strikes back, quote, the next response from us will be immediate and at a maximum level, unquote. Now Tehran has to adjust to the reality that a massive Israeli counterattack didn't come and might never. Well, I don't know about having to adjust to that. Didn't they threaten that if Israel strikes back, quote, the next response from us will be immediate and at a maximum level? Maybe that's what their threat was designed to deter. And evidently it seemed to deter that. Now, we might consider that that is not actually the case if the story being circulated on Twitter by Pepe Escobar specifically the general outlines of the story are that the Israelis, with or without the consent of the United States, as part of that counterattack on Thursday, dispatched an F-35 but towards Iran that was armed with a nuclear weapon. And the way that attack was supposed to proceed was the F-35 would shoot its weapon, um, um, its missile, uh, um, 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 into the high, thin atmosphere, or perhaps even into space, where the nuclear weapon would be detonated and would generate an electronic magnetic pulse that would knock out all the electronics, inside of Iran, leaving it completely open to a very large retaliation by the Israelis. That, of course, never happened. If it did happen, then the result actually never that the F-35 was knocked down by a Russian missile. So that's the story. There are now two independent sources for the story, Pepe says. And tonight he tweeted that shortly he will finish a piece going into more detail on that particular attack. If that attack actually took place, then that would certainly negate the idea that what we have was a lame or low-level retaliation on the part of the Israelis that does not merit further retaliation by Tehran, if the aim of Tehran is still to avoid a regional war. Going on with the peace, as the media and the world awaits full-scale war between Iran and Israel and even frets about nuclear escalation, the huge reality of modern warfare is being overlooked. We are already fighting World War III, say the authors. No, it is not empires marching armies through countries conquering continents. And no, it isn't millions of young men and now women pressed in the uniform on scales of nearly 100 years ago. And no, in most societies where war is a constant, the public doesn't even have to feel the pain of war, except in that the military dominates everything and robs everything else of resources. Programs to fight poverty, food, housing, healthcare, transportation, climate change. Of course, the obvious references to what's going on here in the United States. World War III instead is all around, a planet that is aflame with armed conflict and awash in armed sales. An overlapping Venn diagram of killing that engulfs the globe, and a constant bonanza for national security, quote, experts, unquote, and the military-industrial complex. Now let's take a tour of the battlefield, the authors say. In the Middle East, the U.S., Turkey, Iraq, and even Iran all have footholds in Syria as their internal civil war continues unabated. I think they're referring to Syria's internal civil war, rather than the U.S.'s internal civil war, or Turkey's internal civil war, or Iraq's internal civil war. And all of it goes unremarked most of the time as people look elsewhere for World War II-like battles. Well, I have to say at this point, in some ways, the Iranian conflict has some of the characteristics of World War II, even World War I-like battles. Certainly the attrition campaign that's being fought inside of Ukraine looks more like World War I and the latter days of World War II, with the Russians rolling up the Germans, on the Eastern Front, but losing men, all the way. Of course, that's not on the scale, of millions of men, but altogether, if you combine the Russian armies, and the Ukrainian armies, you are talking about many hundreds of thousands of men, perhaps actually reaching 1 million men, with 500,000 Ukrainian casualties, I should say 500,000 Ukrainian fatalities against perhaps 50 to 75,000 Russian fatalities. Iranian funded or backed or inspired or independent militias in Syria and Iraq target U.S. troops in Syria, Iraq, and now Jordan. The United States bombs, but so does Israel and Turkey and other silent partners of Washington in the war against Iran. Is Turkey bombing right now in the war against Iran? I'm sure Turkey is bombing the Kurds, but I don't know if Turkey is engaged in bombing Iran right now. Is that the implication here? If it is, it's not correct. In the war against Iran and Syria and ISIS and Hezbollah. The fight against ISIS, Operation Inherent Resolve, the U.S. says, involves 80-plus partners fighting not just in Syria and Iraq, but also in Afghanistan and Libya. A coalition of 80-plus countries, but the U.S. is loath to name them all, especially the Allied special operators who are clandestinely working on the ground. Now, I just wonder about that. I mean, there are many people who think that inside of Syria, that the United States is using ISIS, is allied with ISIS to keep the civil war in Syria going, and also to take some of the ISIS fighters to Africa, where they can create chaos, and havoc, and perhaps to use some people associated with ISIS to perform terrorist attacks, in Russia, though the full evidence for that has not come out yet. But there's plenty of evidence that our U.S. operatives in Syria are not fighting against ISIS, but fighting with ISIS. What we do know is that 10 countries have been involved in airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, including the U.S., the United Kingdom, Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, and South Korea. Wow. There are a lot of nations in that coalition, but for most of them, except the US and UK, their involvement is probably minimal, isn't it? Like so many other conflicts, it's not altogether clear who bombed who or from where, nor other members of the supporting cast. The U.S. bombs from aircraft carriers and from the Gulf states and from Kuwait and Jordan, possibly even from Saudi Arabia and Oman. But World War III is about keeping things secret, so who knows? Well, maybe it's not World War III yet. I mean, maybe uh, it's a war involving a lot of non state actors jockeying for advantage, uh, attacking others for their own interest, whether it's monetary or whether to improve their position in certain states where they exist. Going on. In the Red Sea, these same countries, plus France, Italy, Norway, Seychelles, Spain, Greece, Finland, Australia, and Sri Lanka, have joined to fend off Houthi attacks at sea. Even more countries are allegedly participating in the coalition in secret, given the sensitivity surrounding support for Israel during its war with Hamas. But then there's also the war against pirates and the war against nuclear proliferation and the war against arms smuggling and the Middle East war, even against drugs, all carried out by a vast international maritime fleet involving dozens of countries. May involve dozens of countries, but they've been singularly unsuccessful in fending off Houthi control of the Al-Mandab Straits. While Israel's war in Gaza and its back and forth with Iran is atop the Billboard charts for now, in Ukraine, a trench war and a standoff has now dragged on for more than 2 years. Here as well, all eyes have been on some kind of decisive victory or defeat, but World War III is more characterized by Ukraine or its proxies regularly attacking targets inside of Mother Russia, attacks that Moscow displays. Russians fighting on the Ukrainian side are now making regular incursions into Russia's Belgorod and Kursk regions. Meanwhile, the real World War III is NATO already at war with Russia, increasing its activities adjacent to the enemy, expanding its ranks, bringing up its military, and supplying arms to Ukraine. The United States, meanwhile, is deployed from Norway to Bulgaria and has in the past 2 years built up a major new base in Poland. Meanwhile, Iran and North Korea have played their part in shuttling drones, missiles, and artillery shells into the Russian war effort. Though the blatant Russian invasion seems to embody the old-fashioned concept of occupying armies, World War II, the reality is Ukraine never turned into the largest tank battle, quote, the largest tank battle, unquote, ever, as some predicted, nor did it escalate to nuclear war, nor has it even been decisive. All that is true as of this particular second. But if anybody's been watching the front line in Ukraine over the last few weeks or so, there seems a rapidly accelerating collapse of the whole Ukraine military effort in the Donbass going on right now. It looks like the defeat of Ukrainian forces in Donbass is imminent, and that their clearing out of Donbass is also imminent. And it looks like there won't be much to stop the Russians from going to the Dnieper and then crossing it and going into Odessa and in the north, conquering Kharkov and moving on again to Kiev. So The article goes on and says the war in Ukraine is certainly the world-altering event of the past 5 years. But even here, without more borders crossed, without escalation, and without Russia and NATO shooting each other directly, some mighty lessons can be learned. Armies clashing is an illusion. World War III is thus not some conquering army sweeping its way across the continent. At no time have more than 300,000 soldiers been on the battlefield in Ukraine at any one time. I think I doubt that. There may be more than 300,000 soldiers on the battlefield right now. In World War II, it was nearly 10 million now. Nearly 10 million facing each other on a daily basis. Some 125 million mobilized overall. Well, I agree with that. Certainly, it's true. I'm not claiming the war in Ukraine is a world war. I'm claiming it's a proxy war. And it's a proxy war which the Russians are about to win. And in the end, rather handily. And the main question there is going to be whether Ukraine will continue to exist, or whether Russia will stop with 4 more oblasts, all the while bombing Kiev into submission, forcing a surrender, on its part, and terms on Kiev that will involve total demilitarization for Ukraine, total denazification for Ukraine, and neutrality forced on Ukraine forevermore. I don't believe that Russia will have to go any further than that, though the current vote, I don't know if it's gotten through the Senate yet, but if that 61 million gets to Kyiv, then it may prolong the war further. I don't think it will be effective enough to stop the Russians getting 4 more of the oblasts. I think they'll quickly do that. But whether that will be enough to make the government surrender, or whether there won't be a government in exile created by the West, which will establish itself over the part of Ukraine that Russia doesn't move its troops into. That sort of thing may happen. And at that point, once the Russians have gotten all the territories they really want, where cultural Russians are living, it may be the Russians would then accept a frozen conflict, that the possibility also exists that they will continue to attack and move to the Polish border and begin to negotiate with Hungary and Poland, and Romania, to take those parts of Ukraine that used to belong to them. In other words, a situation where the Russians don't even accept a rump state, of Ukraine. I think that possibility is on the table right now. But the point is, I do accept the premise that the war in Ukraine, is not a world war, but it is a proxy war with Ukraine as the proxy, being aided by NATO, and by the U.S. This is a proxy war between NATO and the U.S. on one side, and the Russians, and the Ukrainians on one side, and the Russians on, the other. Because of the greater lethality of weapons, the military casualties in Ukraine have been enormous. They have. But most of the ground engagements have taken place at the company or even platoon level. Massing too many troops in one place is just too dangerous in today's world. Oh, yeah. Because the missiles and drones will blow them apart. It's unsafe to mass troops, okay, at this point. What you have to do is fight with artillery and missiles and drones to take out entrenched troops. And this is all unfolded while neither Russia nor Ukraine have been able to harness air power in the same way the United States has. What? The Russians have seemed to harness a tremendous amount, okay, of air power to fight in Ukraine, if you consider air power to include the drones, the cruise missiles, and the Kinjal missiles, okay, that it's using. Okay, and if you consider that they never intended to create a total devastation in Ukraine. That's never been the Russian objective. They've never wanted to destroy all the infrastructure. They've never wanted to do in Ukraine what the United States did, okay, in Iraq, or what Israel is doing now, okay, in Gaza. It's never been the Russian intention. The Russian intention is to use air power to destroy the military might, okay, of the Ukrainian soldiers, whether they're counterattacking or whether they're dug in and facing Russian attacks. And their air power has been enormously effective in that way. If you consider the missiles and drones as part, okay, of their air power and as part of an integrated modern war combined arms system. The Russians have innovated that in Ukraine in a way that the United States never has anywhere in the world. Going on, other than Vladimir Putin's heartless offensive that used young Russian men as cannon fire. Now that's the tip-off. There is no evidence that the Russians have ever used their young men as cannon fire. There's every evidence that they have been very careful in how they used their young men. Remember when they found themselves spread too thin in the relatively early days of the war, and they retreated so the Ukrainians could take over territory so they could save their young men? And since then, all the attacks, okay, of the Russians have not been using their men, okay, as cannon fire. Okay, now maybe Wagner was using its men as cannon fire, okay, as cannon fodder, okay, in Bakhmut. They were kind of reckless, but the regular Russian army has been conserving its soldiers and putting more and more into the field as time has gone on. 1,500 new recruits every day joining the army out of a patriotism that has not been matched, okay, in modern times. And when I say modern times, I mean since the Second World War, we haven't seen voluntarism like this. The Russian populace seems to view the war in Ukraine as existential for them, as a war they must win. And men are disturbing their lives in the hundreds of thousands to volunteer to fight, in this war. And part of the reason is because they know that their men are not being used as cannon fodder by Vladimir Putin and his military staffs. Anyway, the authors go on to say, few nations want to fight this way, preferring long-range air and missile and now drone attacks. Well, the Russians are using a combined arms effort, and they're fighting a war of attrition. Why are they fighting that kind of war? Because they're about demilitarizing Ukraine, about destroying the armies, of Ukraine, about also destroying the Nazi element in those armies. The Azov battalion and the right sector battalions. Where appropriate, they do prefer long-range air and missile and drone attacks, and attacks at a long distance from guided bombs, a technology which they have mastered and are using to the hilt. But they also, as the centerpiece of their efforts, are still using artillery and, where appropriate, attacks on the ground, not so much to take territory, but to destroy the military might of Ukraine, which they've been largely successful at it. The casualty ratios show that and continue to show that. I find a lot wrong with the author's analysis of what's going on, in Ukraine. I find a lot of acceptance of Western propaganda in what they're saying. South of Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Armenia continue to simmer. Last year, Azerbaijan attacked the breakaway Republic of Artsakh with the backing of Turkey, and Israeli weapons. Azerbaijan attempted to permanently squash the ethnic Armenian enclave, successfully driving tens of thousands of civilians into neighboring countries. So this part of the article is documenting all the different conflicts around the world, though that doesn't make it, a world war, specifically the conflicts in Azerbaijan, and Armenia, continue to simmer. But I don't think that's a part of the world war. With the backing of Turkey, and Israeli weapons, Azerbaijan attempted to permanently squash the ethnic Armenian enclave, successfully driving tens of thousands of civilians into neighboring countries. Yes, true. But was that part of a world war? In what sense? I mean, is Turkey doing this on behalf of NATO? Or is Turkey doing it on behalf of enhancing its position in Central Asia and the position, of Erdogan as the new Sultan, of Islamic nations? Past the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea is also brimming with maritime conflict. Constant Chinese naval passes around the borders of Taiwan are supplemented with close calls with South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and the United States. Meanwhile, the civil war, okay, in Myanmar continues unabated. Yeah, they're pointing to many different kinds of conflicts, but is the conflict part, okay, of the world war? Is this a conflict of the BRICS nations with the collective West? Okay, are we seeing that? Or are we seeing separate conflicts stimulated by the United States? The conflict in Ukraine, the unwanted conflict, okay, in the Middle East. There's no evidence that the United States was looking at the start to support the Israelis in a genocidal attack on the Palestinians. I think the U.S. was content with the war in Ukraine and turning its attention to China. I don't think it wanted a war in the Middle East. I don't think it wants a war in the Middle East actually today. It's supporting Israel because of AIPAC and because of the political commitments to Israel so important in domestic U.S. politics. It's not part of the grand design of foreign policy, okay, in the United States. What the U.S. is doing in terms of its grand design is trying to maintain the hegemony, okay, of U.S. That's what the attack on Ukraine was about. It was about hurting Russia grievously or even breaking it up. What's going on, okay, in the Middle East is something defensive by the United States, trying to maintain its aircraft carrier, so-called, okay, in the Middle East, the Israeli aircraft carrier. In the face of Israeli recklessness in the service of trying to create, okay, a greater Israel, which I don't think the United States really cares about. It was never part of our plan to get involved with Israel in creating a greater Israel. Our involvement in that, okay, right now is reluctant. And it's costing a fortune, and it's delaying the United States turning its attention to Asia. And by the way, Tony Blinken is going to Asia. I think he just left or is at the point of leaving. And the word is he's going to deliver an ultimatum to China. He's going to tell China, stop trading with the Russians. Stop trading, okay, with the Russians, or we will implement severe economic sanctions against you. And you know what? The Chinese are going to say to that, they're going to say in very polite, cool Chinese terms, I'm sorry you feel that way, but you don't get to dictate our foreign policy. You don't get to dictate, okay, our trading policy. And you can go stick it where the sun don't shine. If you feel you have to sanction us, go ahead and sanction us. Then we will sanction you. And guess what? We believe you will suffer far more from our sanctions than we will suffer from your sanctions. Our two countries are vastly interdependent, okay, right now. You, if you do sanctions, will deliver a crippling blow to the U.S. economy, a blow that you have never bargained for. It will be one of the stupidest things, if not the stupidest thing, in a series of stupid things you have been doing for the last 10 years. That's what I think is going to happen with that. But going on with the article, on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea continues nuclear testing and the unannounced firing of ballistic missiles into the ocean. And tensions are a constant background noise of war games, military incursions, and cross border incidents. Thousands of artillery batteries stare each other down across the demilitarized zone, the famous DMZ in Korea. As South Korea points the finger at North Korean technology used in Iranian missiles launched towards Israel. And of course, the United States, I'm not sure, by the way, exactly what North Korean technology has been sent over, okay, to Iran. I was under the impression that it's Russian technology that has been sent over to Iran. But there might be some North Korean technology that has been sent over, but seems to me the giver of the hypersonic technology these days is Russia. They're the source both for Iran and for North Korea, the common source, and for China. And of course, the United States and other, quote, partners, unquote, are active on the ground. Yes, the CIA and its partners active on the ground all over. In a world of supposed, quote, international order, unquote, India and Pakistan continue to fight over their common border as they have been doing for decades. Ah, ah. In recent years, they have been damping down the border conflicts. The article says, and India and China face off another flashpoint that could spiral World War III to some, but one that is already here, okay, in reality. No, the India and Pakistan border conflicts are much reduced in this time because India and Pakistan are both in the BRICS framework and looking to do deals, okay, in that framework, and so are India, okay, and China. I guess India and Pakistan do continue to fight over their common border, but India and China have been dampening down their conflict substantially for years now, and that is not another flashpoint at this point. In Africa, military forces, terrorists, the militants, mercenaries, militias, bandits, pirates, and separatists are active. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project in Angola, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Madagascar, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Sudan, and Sudan. China and Russia scramble for bases and influence. China already has a base in Djibouti. Why no mention of all the nations that the United States has bases in? Why just talk about where China has a base? A lone base in Africa in Djibouti. Russia's Wagner group is active in Africa and involved in combat, and so it is. And the past through months, Rwandan military forces have attacked targets in the sea, and Morocco has conducted drone strikes on Polisario fighters near the western Saharan border. I have to confess, I don't know who the Polisario fighters are. On the African continent, the US, France, and the UK have been involved in expansive yet clandestine fighting, supposedly against Islamic terrorists. Please excuse me while I take a drink. While all around the continent smolders and neither can claim any long-term wins. He's talking now about the U.S., or they're talking about the U.S., France, and the U.K. Neither can claim any long-term wins on the dual fronts of counterterrorism and peacekeeping. Uh, there are American troops operating in Niger, but they're stuck as the U.S. country's government-trained junta claims America's footprint is illegal. They don't just claim it, they're asking the U.S. troops to get the hell out. The United States has also been bombing targets in Somalia for years now, and the African Union mission in Somalia has been actively involved in combating al-Shabaab. U.S. forces continue to fan out across Latin America and the Caribbean using missile cruisers to intercept drug smuggling submarines, sending Marine anti-terrorism teams into a fully destabilized Haiti, and fast-tracking exports of helicopters, aircraft, and naval drones to Guyana as its neighbor Venezuela hungrily eyes its oil reserves. Senior Biden administration officials have floated sending U.S. troops into the treacherous swatch of jungle connecting South and Central America, known as the Darien Gap, to stem the flow of migrants and drugs across the U.S. southern border. And what even happened to neutrality in the past few years? Switzerland and Austria have provided arms to Ukraine. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. Only little Costa Rica, Iceland, as well as Mauritius, Panama, and Vanuatu have no formal armed forces, but even there, Iceland is a very active member of NATO, and Panama is a close military ally of the U.S. Speaking of small countries taking on big fights, Fiji and Luxembourg both count themselves as members of the global coalition to defeat ISIS. I mean, I grant all these things, but how is that a world war? Ubiquitous warfare, our World War III, paints a worldwide picture that is overwhelming, leaving little room to imagine that something can be done about it. And it's hard not to conclude that the superpowers in the national security community, quote unquote, aren't somehow satisfied with the status quo. But as with addiction, the first step toward recovery is admitting you have a problem, or in this case, a global war. So let's entertain the idea further that there is, a global war going on. What is the nature, of that global war? I don't know that this article really defines it. From my point of view, the nature of the global war, is that we have, a hegemonic power. And the hegemonic power is declining. It's losing its capability on any number of dimensions, or at least its capability in many dimensions is decreasing, while the capability of many other nations that do not want to recognize it any longer as the hegemon, that are resisting the hegemony of the United States, and its allies, and the relatively small percentage of humanity that we and our allies actually represent. The rest of the world the global south and other powers who are north, such as Russia, and China, have joined with the global south to resist our hegemony. And they are creating institutions, and economic ties and coalitions that are both political, and economic, and institutions that are political, and that are economic, in order to resist, the hegemon, and to roll back the rule, of the hegemon, as their own military might, increases, and as the multipolar world, emerges, where a number of great powers have a say about what will go on. We see the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, all with major populations above, I guess the Russian population is about 150 million, so they're all above 150 million. Other nations will be joining BRICS soon. Indonesia comes to mind, and their populations is more than 200 million. I don't know whether Pakistan will be joining, but if they're joining, they also have populations above 200 million. My point is, in the multipolar world, there will be a number of centers of substantial power. Right now, we see the United States, and we see China, and we see Russia. But certainly Brazil will be increasing in power as time goes on. Nigeria will be increasing in power as time goes on. Also, India, the most populous nation on earth, will be increasing in power as time goes on. Before this process is through, we may have as many as nine major powers. We may have a world that, in terms of major powers, looks more like looks more like Europe, in the 17th century. Power may be heavily distributed. If we have a world war, and in some ways, if you can point to a world war, it's a world war between the hegemon and everybody else. It's represented by many little brush fire conflicts, but there may be some large-scale conflicts, as in Ukraine as well. Not as large scale as World War II, but major wars. If a full-scale regional war breaks out, in the Middle East, that will be a major war with hundreds of thousands of troops involved. Already, if the war is against Israel, Israel has hundreds of thousands of troops, involved. If the Islamic nations get involved, they will pour hundreds of thousands more troops into that conflict. And it will be on the scale, of Ukraine, if there's a generalized kind, of regional war. So, it will be a war of BRICS, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Friends of the United Nations Charter, that is to say FUNC, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is SCO, and BRICS is BRICS. It will be a war comprised of nations from those institutions facing the hegemon and the allies, okay, of the hegemon. But that war hasn't fully broken out yet. Of course, the possibility of it breaking out may be greatly increased by the trip that Tony Blinken is taking right now to China. It certainly will greatly increase tensions if he offers an ultimatum to China and they go through with the ultimatum. And by the way, this has all kinds of implications for U.S. foreign policy. If they go through with what they're doing with China right now, it has all kinds of implications for the U.S. elections and what our choices ought to be, okay, in the U.S. elections. But to discuss these matters, I'm going to leave that for a future stream, most probably tomorrow night, when there should be some news from Pepe Escobar. But what I want to do for the rest of tonight's stream is to talk about the Aqsa plot. For that, I'm going to refer to this piece from Mondo Ice, if I can find it. Palestinians warn of a Jewish and Christian Zionist plot to threaten the Al-Aqsa Mosque, starting with a red heifer from Texas. Okay, now, many of you who have been watching the streams from Dee and Friends, in which I've taken part, okay, Madeline has taken part, also Greg Mallard, okay, and Dee Pierce herself. You've been there while we've been covering the red heifer issue, okay, and the issue of attacks, okay, on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I haven't covered that too much here, maybe once or twice, but I thought this piece from Mondo Ice was important, and so I want to cover that. Palestinians warn of a Jewish and Christian Zionist plot to threaten the Al-Aqsa Mosque, starting with the red heifer from Texas. Palestinians are warning the world of threats by Israeli religious extremists and Christian Zionists, who are mostly not from Palestine, by the way, to implement a bizarre but lethal plot to demolish the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque to make way for the Third Jewish Temple by Reverend Dr. Don Wagner. This is from April 21st, 2024. And there are, I guess, 5 red heifers arrived in Israel on September 15th, 2022. There's a picture of these red heifers. I have to say, they do not look too red to me. They look like heifers, but they don't look that red. They look more brown. Have they got a red hair on their head? The last thing Palestinians need is another crisis in their homeland. It's not enough that Israel continues its genocidal war in the Gaza Strip with acute starvation, more daily restrictions on vital humanitarian aid, more Israeli massacres in Gaza, and increased settler pogroms in the West Bank, where neither Palestinians nor their land are protected. A regional war in the Middle East still looms as a distinct possibility, As long as Netanyahu thinks he can stay out of prison by continuing the violence and having it underwritten by the United States. And boy, is there anything more anyone can say about the stupid vote coming up, if it's not already taken place, of $26 billion to Israel so it can continue killing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, okay, and in other areas of Palestine, okay, the West Bank, of course, uh, uh, Jerusalem, of course. Uh, I mean, this bill voting 61 billion to Ukraine, 26 billion to Israel, 61 billion to a Ukraine for a war that has been lost, where the armies of Ukraine are on the point of total collapse and retreat. Or if they fail to, total annihilation by the Russians. And we're giving them $61 billion? $26 billion for Israel so it can continue its genocide? Are you kidding me? How can we hope to avoid indictment by the World Court for complicity in genocide? And we've already done enough to do that. But another 26 billion to assist the Israelis in completing the genocide? I have never seen in the history of the United States more incompetent, insane foreign policy than what we are seeing from the Biden administration today. Going on. Beneath the radar is another overlooked threat to regional stability that could easily expand beyond the Middle East to Asia and Africa and pull the United States deeper into the fray. On April 9th, 2024, a number of Palestinian Christian leaders issued a bulletin and petition drive warning the world of threats by Israeli religious extremists and Christian Zionists from here, from the United States, who are intent on implementing a bizarre but lethal plot to demolish the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque to make way for the Third Jewish Temple. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, also known as Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, or the furthest mosque, is the third holiest site in Islam and is referenced in Surah 17 of the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. These holy sites mark the very place where tradition says the Prophet ascended to heaven. Al-Aqsa is also referred to as the Haram al-Sharif, or, quote, the noble sanctuary, unquote, which reflects the same designation for the mosques surrounding the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam. Any infraction or attempt to damage Al-Aqsa or the shrine adjacent to it, known as the Dome of the Rock, could instigate a response from approximately 2 billion Muslims around the world, including the Muslims who live in Iran, of course. That may be the final straw to bring Iran fully into the war. Unnoticed in the mostly sanitized Western media coverage of the crisis in the Gaza Strip was the alarm sounded by Hamas spokesman uh, 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 Abu Ubaidah on the 100th day of Israel's genocide, January 14, 2024. He sounded an alarm alerting the Islamic world and anyone listening that Israel recently brought a certain breed of cows to a settlement in the West Bank. What appeared to some as an irrelevant or bizarre comment was a serious warning to Muslim leaders that a sinister plot was afoot regarding the Haram al-Sharif. Israel had recently bent its regulations banning livestock from entering the country and allowed 5 red heifers to be transferred from a Christian Zionist ranch in Texas to an illegal West Bank settlement. For the past 3 decades, various Christian Zionist ranchers in the United States have been trying to breed 100% pure red heifer, which, according to an obscure ancient priestly cleansing process recorded from the book of Numbers, chapter 19, with commentary by the Jewish sage Maimonides, actually Moses ben Maimon, that is Moses' son, of Maimon, or Moses Maimonides, could commence various rituals leading to animal sacrifices in a rebuilt third temple. However, close to impossible was the necessity to find a pure red heifer before the necessary cleansing ritual could be performed in the revived third temple. Several ultra-nationalist Israeli Zionist organizations and Christian Zionist groups around the globe have been campaigning for the third temple and control of what they call the Temple Mount. The event that stimulated speculation on the Third Temple was Israel's capture of Arab East Jerusalem in June 1967, which was quickly annexed by Israel. Both Christian and Jewish religious extremists interpreted Israel's victory as the beginning of a new messianic era and the countdown to the final days of history, culminating in the Messiah's first or second coming, depending on your religious preference. But ultra-nationalist Jews and fundamentalist Christians agreed that the construction of the Third Jewish Temple was a key stage in the Messianic age. Only 2 obstacles stood in their path. First was locating a red heifer that was completely pure and had never been yoked, as prescribed in Numbers 19, 1-3. With the advent of modern science and genetic manipulation, several Christian Zionist ranchers in the United States embarked on the task of producing a pure red heifer. Through the years, there have been several near successes, but in every case, a white or black hair disqualified the almost sacred bovine. However, the second major obstacle remains somewhat daunting. It is none other than the Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock. Since the late 1960s, there have been a series of violent attempts, and I think there was one just yesterday, by both Jewish and Christian extremists to blow up the Muslim sites. A memorable attempt occurred on March 10, 1982, when 45 ultra-nationalist religious extremists known as the Lifta Group scaled the wall to the Haram al-Sharif armed with explosives. A Muslim guard notified the police, who arrived quickly and arrested the perpetrators. At that time, the Israeli government was committed to upholding the sanctity of the Muslim sites and honored what was known as the religious status quo in Jerusalem. 3 weeks after the Lifta operation, a quarter-page advertisement appeared in the Jerusalem Post demanding the release of the 45 extremists, calling them, quote, earnest, faithful sons of Israel, unquote. The ad was placed by the U.S.-based, quote, Committee of Concerned Evangelicals for Freedom of Worship on the Temple Mount, unquote. The 3 co-chairmen of the committee were the wealthy Oklahoma-based oil magnate Terry Reisenhoover, California businessman Doug Krieger, and Houston clergyman Reverend Ken Loesch. What the 3 had in common was the extreme Christian Zionist belief that the third temple must be built to hasten the Battle of Armageddon, the rapture and return of Jesus. They raised legal fees, and within a year, the militant attackers were released from prison with minimal penalties. I think the key should have been thrown away. The costly legal fees and other expenses were raised by evangelicals, who were given a tax write-off, as the funds secured a 5013 tax-exempt status. See Donald Wagner and Hassan Haddad. All in the name of the Bible, Brattleboro, Vermont, Amana Books, 1986, pages 25 to 26. Most of the militant Jews in the Lifta operation were disciples of Rabbi Meir Kahana, whose Kach, thus, quote unquote, um, the movement, was declared a terrorist organization in the United States and later in Israel. Prior to Israel banning the Kach organization, Kahane had a small but potent following in several militant settlements such as Kiryat Arba, adjacent to Hebron. Israeli journalist Gershom Gorenberg described the Koch Party platform as including, quote, making sexual relationships between a Jew and an Arab Palestinian a capital crime. The party's eventual goal was the expulsion of all Arabs, Palestinians from Israel and the occupied territory, unquote. Kahana's small group of aggressive followers splattered Jerusalem with posters demanding that Israel, thank you, honey, quote, erase the mosques from the Temple Mount, unquote. Today, both Jewish and Christian Zionist websites offer posters of the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount, with the third temple inserted in the place of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. Gershom Gorenberg. The End of Days, Fundamentalism and the Struggle for the Temple Mount, Oxford University Press, 2000, page 128. Kahana may be gone, but there is a revival of his racist views, not only in Kiryat Arba, but across the West Bank settlements, Jerusalem, and Israel, including several members of Netanyahu's cabinet. They include Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, National Knesset Security Chair Zivka Fogel, administered the status of woman Mai Golan, and Zvi Sukkot, who is chair of Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party, to mention a few. All outspoken disciples of the Kahana brand of Zionism and support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the destruction of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Excuse me while I take some pills. It is little wonder that militant Jewish extremists have gained more privileges to, quote, pray, unquote, near Al-Aqsa or disrupt Islamic prayers and at times gain access to the mosque. Netanyahu's rule has popularized the racist Kahane views more than at any other time in recent history, raising the possibility of Israeli political support and weaponizing an attack on the Muslim holy sites. The arrival of the prized red heifer could be the first step towards that frightening reality. And I have to mention here, of course, that Hamas has said that one trigger event of the October 7th attack was the attacks by the Israelis, by the settlers, on Al-Aqsa. For them, that was a trigger event. We got to keep that in mind. It was retaliation for the attacks. Of course, it's viewed by the Western press as, oh, those crazy Hamas people, crazy, brutal, immoral, Hamas people just attacked the peaceful Israelis for no reason. Well, there was plenty of reason. The most recent reason was the settlers' attack on the Muslim holy sites. There's also concern these views are influencing a larger segment of Israelis, including secular Jews. According to a Haaretz poll 10 years ago, 43% of religious Jews and a surprising 31% of secular Israelis supported removing the Muslim shrines. I think that's insane for secular Israelis to support removing the Muslim shrines. Why do secular Israelis care that there are Muslim shrines there? If they're really secular, why should they give a damn? Today, estimates are well over 70% of religious Jews support a temple replacing the Muslim sites, while 40 to 50% of secular Israelis support the project. I think that's insanity. Take Beth Kronfield, a secular American Jew who made Aliyah and founded the quote, High on Har, unquote, organization that provides tours of the Haram al Sharif to promote the construction of the third temple. Recently, Cromfield, and I'm not sure whether it's Cronfield or Cromfield here because it's typed as both in different places, told CBS TV, quote, it's so important for the Jews to return and rebuild the temple. It's not about taking anything from our Muslim brothers and sisters. No. It's taking the whole third holiest site of Islam away from them. It's about preserving this place and being guardians over the house of God for all people. Unquote. Jeez. Apparently, Beth is either ignorant or simply does not care about the violent and sacrilegious impact such an act will have on all Palestinians and the Muslim world. The Sabeel petition is an urgent call to people of all religious faith and of no particular faith who oppose this dangerous plot that weaponizes false religious beliefs and turns them into a political nightmare. I can say that again. Of significant concern is the growing political support these Jews hold in not only the Netanyahu government, but among Republican members of the U.S. Congress. Recently, a leader in the Third Temple movement, Yishak, I guess his last name, is Mamo, of Uvni, Jerusalem, addressed the national gathering for prayer and repentance convened by U.S. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. CBS TV described the meeting as a, quote, who's who, unquote, among fundamentalist Christian Zionists, including Republican members of Congress. As Mamo explained the practical achievements of the project and introduced Byron Stinson, the Texas rancher who helped breed the red heifers. Stinson told the audience that constructing the third temple would usher in the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus. Like hell it will. What will usher in is a nuclear war and the destruction of us all. If there is any hope after Israel's attempt to utterly erase Palestinian lives, history, and presence in the Gaza Strip, it is how the ugly, dark side of Zionism, which rules Israel today, has been exposed as fascist, ultranationalist regime that is perpetrating nothing short of a full-blown genocide of the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip. The long-term solution, and perhaps the only hope for Palestinians and the Israelis, is the decolonization of Palestine and the de-Zionization of Israel. It's a tall order, but the process is underway already. But all hope will be dashed if the Netanyahu government, or even a post-Netanyahu group of fanatic Christian and Jewish Zionists, attempt to destroy the Haram al-Sharif, the removal of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque to prepare the way for a third Jewish temple, will unleash unimagined cycles of violence and repression and must be avoided at all costs. By the way, it will also unleash a process that will lead to the destruction of Israel and to a one-state solution that, in my view, is likely to be an Islamic State, in Palestine. The precise opposite of what is intended by the ultra-Zionists. This is ridiculous. The success of the Iranian retaliation shows how ridiculous, it is. Those missiles got through to two of the Israeli air bases and to a third base, which was an intelligence gathering base in the Golan Heights. Significant damage was done to those areas. That was an attack of 350 drones and cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. What would an attack of 3,500 such missiles do to the settler areas, in the West Bank? The Iron Dome has been shown to be, by the Iranian attack, 97.5% effective. But guess what? That is not sufficient, because enough of the ballistic missiles got through that severe damage was done to the Israeli air bases. If those missiles were aimed at the West Bank settler territories, civilian casualties would immediately be severe and would be mostly limited to the settlers, because the ballistic missiles that would get through can be very, very accurate, extremely accurate, and restricted to the settlers and their settlements themselves. There would be nothing so well calculated to send those 750,000 settlers packing back to where they came. If the Israelis keep on pushing this, in my view, that is one of the results that can be expected to happen. Not to mention devastating attacks on Tel Aviv and Haifa and other important areas. This red heifer business is an insane provocation. It is totally irresponsible. It is based on myth and religious fanaticism. It should have no place at all, in the Middle East. I will now begin to consider your comments. Let me just check one thing. Keep on checking the Pepe Escobar archive to see if he's released his article yet. So, there are a few comments other than greetings. I'm watching on my TV, not watching the comments 100%. Hope everything is well with you, Kay and Steve. Kay says, okay here, Lana. And D is here and says, Steve, hi, Kay, hi, Lana. And D says, hi, Steve, Kay, Lana. And 6IX, that's 69, I think. And the war against the homeless here, in the United States, Kay says, yes. Steve says, hello, 69. Kay says, World War III is likely to be nuclear. I think so, too. I think that's going to be the defining characteristic of World War III. Steve Wolfbrand says, the good news is our universities are erupting in student protests. That is very good news. The most student activism we've seen since the Vietnam War, for sure. And remember, during the Vietnam War, we had the tragedy of Kent State. But after that tragedy, the universities began to accommodate the students. They began to realize the only possible course was to stop trying to repress the students and look for accommodation on those campuses. And that's what happened. And that's what's likely to happen now, too. Because I don't think the students are going to quit, not while a genocide is going on. Kay says Bernie wants to limit Israel's money. Of course he does. Of course he does. Kay says, okay, guys, I'm out of here. Love you all. Steve says, good night, Kay. Steve says, watching CNN, cops arresting student protesters, okay, at NIU, at NYU as we speak. I can't refrain from noting that when you're speaking, okay, of NYU, you're speaking, okay, of a university that has a very high percentage of Jewish students around, okay, the New York area. The nickname of NYU, okay, is NY Jew. So you've got a predominantly Jewish college, okay, and university with very large protests going on. Cops being called in to arrest, okay, the students, as if the universities didn't learn anything from the protests of the 1960s. Of course, the people running the universities right now are too young to remember those protests. But those of us who were alive then do remember the protests very, very well. Okay, that's all for tonight, I think. Tomorrow, let me look at what I've got going here. I think tomorrow I'm going to take another day. Well, I'll be on at 8 o'clock tomorrow, of course. But I think I'm going to take another day to explore what's going on, okay, in the international system. I think I'm going to spend another day on the idea, okay, of the World War and the characterization of the World War as the United States and its allies against, I'm sorry, I should have said, the BRICS nations and the various countries that are coming into BRICS, okay, and that are joining BRICS and that are joining SCO and that are joining FUNC against the hegemon and the allies, okay, of the hegemon. I want to explore that further. In previous streams, I've indicated that conflict, okay, is very important. I don't think there's a world war yet, but if there's a world war developing, that's the cleavage that we have to look at. It's between the advocates for a multipolar world, okay, and the hegemon and the allies of the hegemon, still wanting to keep the rest of the world in thrall, unwilling to accept the emergence of the multipolar world that we see before, okay, our eyes. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about that, and I'm also going to talk about I'm going to talk about a report that was actually released in January, but which I've never talked about here before. The title of the report is Hyperimperialism. It was issued by the Tricontinental Institute. I'm going to talk about some of what that report has to say, tomorrow, in terms of its views about the changes that are going on, and also what an alternative world could look like. So thank you very much for coming tonight. And those are my coming attractions, for Wednesday. So hopefully I will see you tomorrow night. This was a relatively well-attended stream. I hope you'll come again, tomorrow night for what promises to be a very interesting stream. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, everybody, just a few minutes ago. Good night, Steve. And good night, everybody, from Bonnie, and I. Thank you very much for coming.